Hello and good morning, everybody. This is Rico Manalo, Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc., with another episode of All Aces on Air. Today, I am here with a very, very special guest and dear friend of All Aces, Chris Conroy, who is also, in addition to being I don't know, is it the founder of the Wellspring Group?
Co-founder.
Co-founder, right? And you do that with your wife, correct?
That's correct.
Yes. So, co-founder of the Wellspring Group, as well as the host of the podcast Whiteness at Work. So today we've got something kind of special. He is not only a guest, but he's actually co-hosting this show with me. So, good morning, Chris. And would you maybe introduce yourself a little bit further to the audience?
Sure. Good morning, Rico. It's good to see you, brother. And thank you for having me on the program today. I'm super excited to be here, and it's a real pleasure. So my name is Chris Conroy. I'm a partner at the Wellspring Group, which is a consultancy that supports racial equity learning across multiple organizations, both in the United States and Canada. And I'm partnered in that effort with my wife, Kadesh Sims, who's an amazing individual on many, many levels and a fantastic business and personal life partner. And so the bulk of my focus of my work is connecting with folks to unpack concepts related to whiteness and white identity, white racial identity, and figuring out what role those have to play, and committing to racial justice in our daily lives. So that's what I do, and hopefully we'll have some time to talk about that today, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. That's it. That's the bulk of it.
Very cool, very cool. And just to make it really clear for those who are watching, this episode is very much about internalized whiteness and how that can show up in our racial equity journeys and in the work of advancing racial equity. So to get us started, we've got our usual question. So, Chris Conroy, in 30 seconds or less, how did you become you?
Well, it was a rainy Tuesday. No,
Let me take some notes.
yeah, right. So I have been really interested in understanding justice and fairness, I think, my whole life. And as a kid, I probably had I think my mom would probably testify to the fact that I had a pretty unusual overcommitment to that, wrestling with the idea of what was fair and what wasn't.
Oh, yeah.
So I was one of those kids. And I think that I was really attracted to this idea of the law very early on. I was like obsessed with those, Law and Order type shows. I was very into like, A Few Good Men was like a movie that I was really into when I was a kid. I read like all the John Grisham books, right, about lawyers. And I was kind of obsessed with this idea of, like can through kind of like rational argument and kind of people doing their detective work and their homework, can we find the truth, and can the truth help us get to, and can revealing the truth help us get to a better world or get to a more fair world? And I think that led me to a lot of different places, but first and foremost, it led me to the Suffolk County and the Plymouth County District Attorney's Office for a series of internships when I was a very young pup, just graduated from high school and in the college. Having had, some background and some knowledge of racism just through the relationships that I had in my own life, right, whether it be with friends or, just seeing the world that I was living in general, right? I played football, so, a bulk of my friendships, allowed me to connect with other young men like myself across a wide variety of racial and economic backgrounds, which I think is one of the cool things about sports. But when you get exposed to that, you also get exposed to the knowledge of what other people's lived experiences is all about. And so I came to kind of understand what race looks like in that context. by having friends that weren't from the same race as myself, and didn't have the same lived experience as myself. And then I kind of took that relational knowledge and brought it with me to my first experiences outside of school, trying to make a way in the world and figure out how to find justice, and how to contribute to that. And I was introduced up close and personal to the American justice system and how it actually works, for the first time during those internships. And what I didn't see was justice, right? I didn't see the things that I thought I would see in those books, back when I was a kid, and in those movies
So
when I was a kid.
just to kind of summarize and collect here,
Hmm.
you had built up this idea of fairness, justice, and truth, like kind of an archetypical good guy, if you will.
Yep.
And then when you got the opportunity, you went to where the good guys are supposed to be, and you saw that it didn't match your mental image. Yes.
10-4, absolutely 100% on point. And the tricky thing was, right, the messed up thing is that the guys that I thought were good guys, I still felt that there were pieces of them that were really good guys, and yet they were participating in a system that was unfair and unjust. And for lack of capacity to deploy their sense of fairness and justice in a different direction, or lack of interest in doing so, or just, you know, a whole bunch of other reasons that I probably wasn't privy to at that time, they chose not to question kind of the underlying assumptions that created that injustice and unfairness, in that work. And so this is that's not to disparage anybody who's doing work on behalf of, any kind of, any kind of work at the Suffolk or Plymouth County District Attorney's Office. There's some amazing people in those institutions, and those institutions do an incredible amount of good, in certain contexts.
I
But
mean, what
vis-a-vis,
I'm hearing you say, though, Chris, if I could just
Mhm.
break in, is
Yeah, please.
that uh, you've got people that obviously, as you say, have good parts of them and probably want to be more of that part of them, right?
Hmm.
But they're operating within a system that kind of constrains their ability to do that. Is that what I'm hearing?
100%. Yeah, I think so. I mean, you know, I I also think it comes down to how do you see yourself in your role,
Okay,
right? I think we put on roles professionally, and I was attempting to do so at that time as a young person, right, as a young adult,
sure.
and um, the men primarily, because they're mainly men in these roles, although there were several women who were really influential in my development during this period of time. Um, Shout out to Nudis Camargo, who was there at the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office when I had my first internship there, and is a phenomenal person, was in the Patrick administration, and was my mentor in that particular role.
Very cool.
But the men in that context, I think, often saw themselves as the good guys, but often kind of in this role where they had the worldview where bad things happen, and really bad things happen, really evil things happen, and I need to be the person that stands at the door to prevent evil things from happening, right?
Mm,
So with that kind of worldview, right, and this adoption of this very binary system of bad guys and good guys, even if that can be more, even if it's slightly more nuanced than that in practice, in theory, and kind of like the assumption of how to go about doing that work, if you kind of see yourself as the good guy all the time, or the necessary good guy holding back the bad guys, um, there's problems with that. There, there's things that start to come out of that become problematic.
yeah, so that kind of reasoning, a lot of people think in terms of binary, so opposites, but instead
Mhm.
of like logical opposites. So, for example, we've got good guy. The logical opposite of good guy is just guy, not bad guy, right? That's the polar opposite. So I think that's
Hmm.
so interesting.
Hmm.
But I can, like just like anything else, I imagine that if you're doing this day in, day out, that you become faster at identifying who are in the bad group, and perhaps it becomes somewhat automatic, or maybe it becomes something that people don't think about so intentionally before they make that evaluation.
Well, yeah, I'll give you a more concrete example, right? So I was part of very early on, I was part of this program called the Safe Neighborhood Initiative, which is a federal
Mm,
program that was operating through the Suffolk, through the district attorney's office, right? So the Safe Neighborhood Initiative was a federal initiative through the Bush administration that was intended to be able to provide a different form of outreach to communities that the district attorney's office was consistently um, having an impact on, right? Either through
mhm.
arrests or prosecutions, et cetera, and to build relationships with that community through community leaders and community liaisons and through meetings where the district attorney's office would go out and engage, right? With in conversation with the community. So what I found was that if you look at the structure of the district attorney's office, there's the DA, and then there's ADAs, assistant district attorneys, who do much of the prosecution of cases. And then there's victim witness advocates, right? So there's folks that are supporting victims or witnesses to crimes and then providing services to them to help support them and help them move through a prosecution or a case or a trial, or to get resources to help them heal from the trauma that they encounter through these kinds of through by being involved in traumatic events.
Sure.
Um, so we have an office with a bunch of ADAs, some investigators, some and two, I think, victim witness advocates that I know at the time. And we would I was partnered with the Safe Neighborhood Initiative. Now, what's really
Gotcha.
interesting is that the Safe Neighborhood Initiative was one victim witness advocate and one ADA out of the entire structure of maybe like a dozen or so. I don't know, maybe less than a dozen. I'm not sure exactly how many ADAs there were in the office at the time, but
Sure.
pretty good amount, probably less than a dozen, between half a dozen and a dozen ADAs. And out of that group of ADAs, there was one ADA that was selected for this role, right? Rasan Hall, who's an amazing guy and is now doing tremendous work, has done tremendous work with the ACLU of
Mm,
Massachusetts. Um, but Rasan and Nudis were, again, mentors for me in this process. They were the ones that were going out to the community and having conversations with the community about what resources the district attorney's office could help bring to help solve some of the issues that were happening.
mhm.
Inevitably, you run into this challenge where, as an ADA, you're prosecuting people,
Yeah.
right, in a courtroom, and you're going out to the community, and then you're meeting with their cousins or their aunts or their mothers or fathers or whatever, right? You're
Mm,
having these interactions where you see the humanity, right? If you're in a meeting with somebody and you're asking them, what do you need? That's a very humane question to be asking somebody.
yeah.
And so you have this very human interaction. And then you go to a courtroom or you go to a district attorney's office, and then there's pictures on the wall of their kids. And these are supposed to be the quote unquote bad guys that you're putting away.
Mm,
And yet you're right. So there's this really odd juxtaposition between the system that's operating and putting people behind bars, right, which our country does at a rate that's higher than any other country in the world, and arguably, throughout history. You look at and then you look at the inverse, right, the actual going out and asking questions and connecting with people,
mm,
and and you see the actual human connections that are able to be made, and it's this really weird juxtaposition. It's contradictory, and because Rasan and Nudis were so humane and so engaged in this work, it really made me think, like, well, should my work really be focused on supporting the legal system, or should it be try to align myself with these very humane, knowledgeable, um, wholehearted people like Rasan and Nudis who are going out and really making human connections with people. And so
Uh,
that's what pushed me into this different direction.
okay, so would you kind of capture that as I don't know if you want to say it's a crystallizing moment for you, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how did you first actually embark on your racial equity journey to the point where you were kind of realizing like, hey, there's this thing, whiteness, and as a white man, of course, subject to that. Um, I'm just really curious about how that all did it hit you all at once? Did it come in dribs and drabs?
No, I mean, so I think the more that you dig into your identity and what shapes your identity, the more you realize that I don't know if this is true for you, Rico, but like there's moments where you think back to when you were younger and you're
Yeah.
like, oh, that's what I was feeling at that time. Right. That thing had something to do with my racial identity, or that has something to do with my overall identity that is connected to race. And now I'm remembering it, and I had a weird feeling at the time, but now I can place it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think when we talk about the construction of our identity, right, there are some things that it makes some people uncomfortable to feel like there are parts of their identity that they don't get to make, right?
Yeah.
That are constructed for them. But that's the nature of being a human being, is that you step into a culture, you're born into a culture, you're born into a particular place, and then you have to learn how to navigate that. And so, uh, n- you know, initially there were some things that I were aware of where I was like, personally, this feels weird. And then I don't really connect with it like everybody does, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then um, there were some more explicit events that I think were more explicitly about race. So I think first and foremost, um, you know, to talk about what we were talking about a little bit earlier, prior to the show, John A. Powell, who's an incredible legal theorist and talks quite extensively about rationality, is a wonderful professor, talks about whiteness as the logical conclusion of the European Enlightenment project of the isolated self.
That's a
So
title.
that is the title. I'm going to credit Gibran Rivera, who is another great mentor of mine, and who pointed me in the direction of that particular reading. But that concept rings really true, right? It's this
Mm,
idea that um, through rationality, um, through a particular kind of governance, through a particular kind of way of approaching the world, we can reach this version of an idealized self, right, way up here in the clouds.
yeah.
And and I think that for me, part of that experience was growing up in an environment in a town, suburban America, right? Moving out of the city when I was very young and moving into a suburban environment, and um, and having this experience where I knew there were people who were not white in the world, right? I knew that there were things happening beyond me, right? Like whether we're talking about, as a 10, 12-year-old, you start to become aware of things like the external world through the news, right? And so the Gulf War is happening in 92. I'm going to date myself here because I'm 38 years old, right? So, but the Gulf War is happening, right? Rodney King riots are happening. Football is happening. Most of my superheroes that I'm watching on TV, right, are black men, right? Because
Mm,
they're playing in sports, and you can see them being celebrated in that context and then disparaged in others, right? I'm listening to Nas, I'm listening to Biggie, I'm listening to like pretty much like any kid that's interested in East Coast hip hop. I'm in that space. So I'm seeing these things, I'm experiencing these things, and then at the same time, um, I'm growing up in a community where it's like, get the house, right? Get the 2.5 kids, get the dog, play soccer on the weekends,
right. Right.
watch the game on weekends, and then like that's it, right? You're like, is there something else that's supposed to be happening here?
I think
Like,
you forgot mowing the lawn.
or
That's another
no,
one.
definitely mowing the lawn. That was definitely a part of it. Although my dad would probably say, he would
Yeah.
probably, hey dad, he would probably take issue with that. I mow the lawn now, but I was probably more difficult to get to do back then.
I mean, honestly,
Um,
my dad also has an issue with me mowing the lawn. So, hey, Dad, publicly acknowledging that as well.
um, but and I think growing up in that environment, most people feel this, right? In
Yeah.
some way, shape, or form. You grow up in a small town. You grow up in you're like, okay, is there something more? Is there something beyond this? And most people don't associate that with whiteness, right? But I've
Yeah.
come to associate a piece of that with the culture that surrounds the construction of white identity.
Gotcha.
And there's been different clues that point the way towards that, but I think that's the first memories I can think of that I can now associate with that identity.
Yeah. I mean, reflecting on my own identity formation, it's much easier for me to see right now as a 35-year-old man that, yeah, there are definitely parts of my identity that I didn't intend to construct, but I constructed in response to something.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember a number of moments in my own childhood that were kind of weird in that, well, to explain a little bit, I
Please.
grew up in New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm.
I'm obviously, like, my parents are not from New Hampshire, they're from the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And
We're in New Hampshire, if you don't mind me asking.
oh, sure, I'm from Durham, New Hampshire, which is
Okay.
where the university is.
UNH. Yep.
UNH, yeah. So I do recall the first instance of me getting into some kind of trouble over identity was, and I was in kindergarten, a
Mm-hmm.
neighbor asked where my family was from, so a version of that, where are you from, where are you really from kind of question that
Mm-hmm.
I've become so familiar with since then. But my response, instead of telling the truth, I'll admit I just straight up lied. I said that we were Eskimos, and I know that's not the right term now, and
Mm-hmm.
that we lived in an igloo. And she just kind of took that as truth. So the trouble came later when she came to the house or something. My dad answered the door.
Mm-hmm.
I was not there for the conversation, but he asked me why I had said that we were Eskimos and that we had lived in an igloo. And
Mm-hmm.
my response, I can't recall exactly, but it was something along the lines of, I thought I could get away with it because she clearly did not know.
Right.
Right. So that's a powerful thing for a child to understand. Like,
Yeah.
oh, because people don't know what I am,
Mm-hmm.
I can tell them whatever I want, and that's powerful. The
Mm-hmm.
other side of that coin is I don't know what I am either. So then trying to figure out who I was by comparing myself to this, in my case, almost a monolith of whiteness, and not even understanding what whiteness was.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit more about I'm when you when you chose that, can you think back to that moment and think about why you might have chose what you chose?
Uh, I mean, I did have kind of a fascination with representations of Native peoples that
Mm-hmm.
I saw in my books. And on reflection, it's probably because when I looked in the mirror, my face was more similar to those depictions than the ones I was seeing around me.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe that was something that I just thought was really cool. Like, as a child, just imagining being out in this snowy place. Well, then I kind of like enjoyed the cold and the snow. Now I don't, but it was maybe something to aspire to, or something that I hoped could be true, or something.
That's kids are amazing that way, right? And you think
Yeah,
about um, what you're able to construct in a very short period of time on the spot,
yeah,
right? Which is why I love working with kids. When I was teaching, right, that was one of the benefits of being able to work with kids,
yeah,
is that they will think of creative ideas, right? They'll come up with they'll have a go at it, right? They'll figure out like how am I going to navigate this situation? Then they'll give it a shot, and they're not so kind of gun shy, or kind of they're not so weary from, having, people shoot down their ideas,
Yeah.
that they'll that there's not that self-consciousness at that stage. So I think that's really interesting, right? As you get older, are there like, and as you encounter again that concept of whiteness, right? Did you feel like, can you talk a little bit more about like how you navigated it as you kind of continue to bump up against it? Are there like other incidences where, not 5-year-old or 6-year-old Rico, but like 12-year-old Rico
Mm.
is having to reconstruct his identity again in opposition to whiteness, or in the mirror or in the gaze of whiteness, and then how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that I do recall very clearly is at some point, so I mentioned that there was like kind of a white monolith where I come from. I'm
Yep.
not the only Asian American from Durham, New Hampshire of my age,
Yep.
but there were really very few. There were, because of the university, there were some other Asian kids.
Yep.
Mostly their parents were also immigrants like mine, but they might not have been born in the US. My best friend growing up, who's really more like my brother, his parents are from India, and he grew up. We basically grew up together. But what's interesting to me is I never actually saw him struggle with whiteness in the way that I did, because most of the other Asian or Asian American children more closely resembled me than him. So I think I was much more aware of this. And not to disparage any of my former classmates, but what I saw outwardly was that they were very much kind of that demure, shrinking violet kind of person. And that's really decidedly not me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do know that one of the coping mechanisms that I had was I was a class clown. I was
Mm-hmm.
always making people laugh. I was always doing things to get attention on myself. And part of that was so that I could show people I am not like those other quiet, demure, more stereotypical
Mm-hmm.
Asians.
Mm-hmm. What'd your dad have to say about this? So you say
Um,
your dad was the first one that confronted you, like, hey, why'd you describe yourself in this way? Like, what was that like as you kind of were going through those phases?
I mean, so what I do remember very clearly is another thing that I should mention about my background is I learned very quickly that when my parents wanted to have a private conversation, they'd switch from English into Tagalog.
Yeah.
And at the time, Tagalog, by the way, is the language that my parents speak from the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And this was not intentional at all, but this was also kind of the era of Dr. Spock, like not from Star Trek, but the child psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the guy at the time that was saying bilingualism is bad. So they
Mm-hmm.
never taught me the language that they speak.
Mm-hmm.
Although I can understand what they're saying, I can't really speak it myself.
Mm-hmm.
So right there, I knew that there was a difference, and it didn't really kind of crystallized for me until later. But at some point, I really realized when I was a teenager, we are having such trouble with each other because of cultural differences. They had an expectation of me, and I don't think on purpose, growing up along the lines that they were familiar with for a child, right? So they had maybe an archetype of what a child-parent relationship should be, which is
Mm-hmm.
really different from the child-parent relationships here.
Yep.
Uh, and I remember it was on a TV show or something, but there was a kid that called their parents by their first name, and my parents saw that and were like, "No,
You
not
had this
ever."
moment. You had this moment where you looked at each other and they were like, "Don't try it."
Yeah, I don't think any words were even said. It's just like message received.
Got it. Cool. Cool. What? So I mean, so how did? What do you think that they were trying to do? Right? Because it sounds like there were some things that they were rejecting about like a traditionally, culturally white experience, right? Or Western kind of experience, like whatever you want to call it, right?
Mhm.
Um, uh, there were pieces of that they were like, nah, we're not having it. And
Yeah.
don't you even think about it. And then there's other pieces of it where they're like, we are explicitly going to not have you learn this part of our our cultural tradition. You're going to start to learn this part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think they made the decisions that they did with you as a parent? Because as a parent now, I know my wife and I were like always like we're always talking about like how do we make decisions, right? With the
Yeah.
kids and like and what are we explicit about and what are we not? Why do you think that they made the decisions that they did for you?
So one huge difference between the US and say the Philippines is that in the US, people really think about the nuclear family. So mom, dad, the kids. Most of my friends growing up, they didn't even know their cousins. They didn't know their uncles or their aunts. Whereas I grew up knowing that my father has more than 20 brothers and sisters, like half
Wow.
brothers, half sisters as well.
Yep.
Yeah, like extended family, that is family. You don't add the modifier extended, is just family.
Okay.
So a lot of these things, like in terms of social support networks, what we're seeing, especially right now during the pandemic and everything else, is a lot of Americans do not have a strong social support network.
Yep.
A lot of people feel super isolated. You can't really be isolated in the Philippines because there's people around you all the time.
Okay.
Like if you're a little child and you're looking for your mom and you're just like yelling, Mom, 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 like 8 different women are going to come running and be like, what's wrong? You know?
Yep. It and that played into their decision to how in terms of how to parent you in the US. How did that play into their decision and to make decisions about how to explicitly parent you through this kind of cultural change, right? They know you were going through cultural change. How did the idea of family play into that?
I mean, that's really, now that I'm kind of reflecting on it, a lot of those interactions, there were a lot of implicit things, right? And so I'm not sure if I really understood all of them. But I do remember that as a younger adult, like probably in college at some point, I was talking to my mom, and she straight up said, if we had better, well, sorry about the truck,
All good.
you know, if we had better family support or we'd been around more family than in this country, then she probably would have had more than just me.
Mm.
Because and I don't blame her. I understand that as a kid I was probably, well, definitely a handful. So
Same here. Yeah. For sure.
yeah. Yeah, but this whole thing about internalized whiteness, I mean, it is really uncomfortable to reflect on.
Yeah.
One of the things I really learned again by coming to work at All Aces is that I had to internalize a further amount of whiteness just to get through grad school. You know, how to learn how to speak like somebody who has a master's degree, how to write in a way that could be taken seriously academically. And what I was not building the skills for in grad school were the skills to really break those down in ways that people could easily understand. The language was kind of not a symbol, but more of like some of the trappings of a certain kind of power, right?
Yep.
And that's a little bit uncomfortable to sit with too, because communication is all about exchanging ideas. If what you're exchanging is, I know more than you and I'm better at whatever than you, like, well, that doesn't make for great conversation in my experience.
No, it does not. Yeah. I mean, I think what you're pointing out is that there's a subtext, right? So communication there's explicit parts of communication, like the top layer, like the actual words I'm saying in it, and then there's a lower level, right? Or there's deeper levels to it, which is like how I'm saying things, what's my body language, what am I attempting to project, right, in the conversation. Does that resonate?
No, 100%. I mean,
and so you're adopting a subtext.
Yeah, and as a kid, the wonderful thing about kids is that they do take things at face value a lot of the time. And
Yep.
that's how they end up with these really interesting ideas about things that we
Right.
never thought about. At some point, we learn to read the subtext, right? But
Hmm.
there's not anybody out there just sitting down with us and teaching us, hey, this is how you navigate subtext the way that we would learn to read a book, right?
Right.
You get some of that if you go to a school where they have teachers that are willing to engage with students on that level, but I don't think we can say that's generally true.
No, no. I mean, we get most of that through our just for personal relationships, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How to read people, how to read the world, right? How to think about things, how to see beyond the words that people are using.
Yeah.
That's all cultural. That's all from like again. That's why I always talk with people about their parents and their upbringing, and why I always reflect on mine when I think about these circumstances, and not just think about my own upbringing, but like think about their upbringing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because again, a lot of this subtext is stuff that we're born into, and it's critical to understand. I think you did a really beautiful job of illustrating, right? Like when I went to the academy, when I went and got my master's, or when I went and got my professional degree, I started to adopt these kinds of not just words and phrases and ideas, but there's also this subtext that I learned to use in order to be able to get power, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, and I don't think I think we run up against one of those problems, all the time when we start talking about whiteness. People don't really see that. People are like, well, that's not whiteness. That's just what people do when they get their doctorate, or that's just it's what people do when they get their master's degree,
Right.
or that's just the way things are, right? And that is that that ignores this idea, right? That when you build a system, or you build a human system, you build it with a culture,
Yeah.
and you build it with a dominant culture. There's a prevailing culture in which you construct it, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking, like, there's that really tired sitcom joke where a doctor, a lawyer, somebody with a professional degree is
Mhm.
explaining something to usually the main character. The main character kind of goes, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then at the end, the punchline is, in English, please, right?
Right.
And it's like, okay, so right there, we're saying that people with these degrees, we know that they communicate differently and it's powerful and we don't understand it. Ha ha ha, isn't that funny? Like, no, actually, if we look at that, I don't think that's funny at all.
Right. It's problematic.
Yeah.
When you think so when you think about uh where you go from there, right? So given who you feel Rico is, right? Who you are right now, right? How do you so you notice that about yourself, right? And
Yeah.
you notice that's you're dealing with a kind of power there, and you know that the power per your joke, right? Per the joke, right? That's often written into things or sitcoms, like it's problematic. What do you start? How have you started to deal with that, or unwind that, or check that with yourself?
Well, I mean, certainly with the team and when I'm engaging with clients and things like that, I do take a lot more care now to make sure that I'm explaining it in a way that I think that most people could access.
Right.
And the really interesting thing about that process for me, and this is how I know that it's really internalized, is when I am intentional about reflecting on it, I can sometimes feel an emotion kind of rising, like, like, oh man, I worked really hard to get this status and this power. Like, I want to be able to embody that thing. And it's like that provokes some pause in me. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so am I just out for myself, or am I actually going to practice what I preach and try to improve things not only for myself but for everybody?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think
So this is like in the context of if you're in a meeting or if you're in a conversation and someone's like, "Hey, Rico, like, just
Yeah.
explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old," right?
Well, so my background is in conflict resolution,
Okay.
and a lot of times we've got people who are dealing with real conflict in their organizations, and they don't know what to do about it. And so, for me to come in and just throw all my jargon around, is that going to help them, or are they going to be like, "I'm just more confused now than I was before"? Like, thanks for
Right.
trying to help me, but in fact, you just made more stuff for me to get through.
Right. Right. For sure. Uh, the weird thing is that the more you get, the more you get, if you and I were talking and you threw something out to me that I didn't quite understand, I believe that you and I have the relationship where I'd be like, "Hey man, like slow down, like back it up, like let's rewind it," right?
Yeah, yeah.
But if you go into a workplace, right, you're an expert. Like
Hmm.
like you build your career providing conflict resolution um, services and supports and ideas, right? When you go into an organization that's having problems with conflict resolution, I bet for sure there's times where you might go in and there might be 10 people in the room who are all senior leaders and like they also too have their degrees and they also too have their certificates on the wall, right? And you go in, you throw down a bunch of jargon and everyone's nodding their head,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
But and they also are probably thinking like, can we make this a little bit more simplified? But they don't say it.
yeah.
And
Right.
you end up going through an entire training, you end up going through an entire process, right? Where that organization's paying you or investing time and people power. And because there's this more of a respect for the power than the
Hmm.
relationship, there's no progress made.
Yeah. So I'll tell you about something that happened pretty recently. We were working with a group of people,
Mhm.
and they're all really adamant that they needed mediation.
Yeah.
All right. They're like, "We need mediation." They kept going on and on and on and on about it. And so instead of kind of coming in being like, "Hey, I'm a mediator," I really just sat back and listened for a while. And at one point, it became really clear to me like, oh, this group of people has heard the term mediation. They know that it's related to conflict resolution,
Hmm.
but they don't know what it means.
Right.
Or like, so at some point, I very kind of quietly found a gap in the conversation, and I was able to ask, like, so I am a mediator. Can anybody kind of help me to understand what it is that you're all saying when you need mediation? Which led to a really great conversation about explaining exactly what mediation was, the different approaches, and just laying out options for people.
Hmm.
And as soon as that was done in a very simple way, they were able to come back together as a group and be like, no, actually, we don't need mediation, but we do need conflict resolution. And it was so great that we could get these options because we didn't even know how to ask for those options.
Right.
Right. So it was a really humbling experience for me because, again, I just have to come back to people can't know what they don't know. And
Yeah.
it's simple, we all know it. But I find that I have to check myself with that a lot, and I feel better for it.
Yeah.
And that applies to myself too, right? So when I feel really terrible about some of the things that I've become aware that I've internalized, instead of getting down on myself and being like, oh, I'm a bad person, I'm that, uh, it really helps to fit in with that analogy, not analogy, but the image of the racial equity journey, right?
Yeah.
So it's it's about taking those first steps. It's about putting one foot in front of the other, and
Hmm.
eventually you'll get there, or you'll wind up somewhere else, and maybe that's okay too.
Well, I mean, to take that analogy and then put it back on the thing, like the conversation you had with the group, man. Like, I think what was interesting is, so you started with a really human question, right?
Mm,
Which, what do you need?
yeah.
So when people start to tell you what they need, you humanize them,
Hmm.
right? First of all, they got to be vulnerable because they actually have to tell you what they need,
Yeah,
right?
and that's a huge thing too. Yeah.
And so there's trust that you're creating through the question, right?
Hmm.
And then the next thing is that you also combated probably the internal emotion that you had where you're like, oh man, I gotta act like the expert. I gotta come in with all the answers, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to do that because I'm gonna alienate people by like using a whole bunch of jargon, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you combated that by being curious.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you can't be curious and fearful at the same time, right?
Yeah.
You can't be curious and angry or anxious with yourself at the same time, right? I mean, you could, like, it's conceivable that you could, but one is going to predominate over the other. And
Mm-hmm.
if I go deeper into the question and I become more involved with your world, then I'm building a relationship with you and I don't have to rely on my jargon to feel like there's some power in the room.
Mm-hmm.
We create that power together.
Yeah, and so we've been talking a lot about relational approaches to things, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that this is a really important thing to focus on because you're making a connection with another human being rather than the armor and the things that they use to project this image of themselves, right?
Yes. Yeah. Which is what we do all the time.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah.
When you got your suit on, your tie, and you're projecting like, I know things, don't question me, pay me a lot of money, kind of thing.
Sure. Yeah. And that's real. I
Yeah,
mean, anybody who's been in business will tell you that that's real,
yeah.
right? But again, that's within the context of particular cultural symbols and
Hmm.
particular cultural values. And so once you start to question those values, that's when things get interesting.
For
So
sure.
I'm not saying that that's where solutions start to show up, but things at least start to get a little bit interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so I wonder, in the course of your podcast, Chris, like, have you been able to kind of, I don't know, get a sense of what it might take or approaches that would be effective in kind of broaching the topic of internalized whiteness with somebody who maybe isn't so familiar with the topic, or maybe they've seen it but they haven't really dug into it?
Yes.
Okay, I hope that's
Uh,
not the wrong answer.
it's not the long answer. So it's build relationships, man. Right. Uh, I think start on the home front, right?
Mm,
Like how did I do it with my dad, right? Right. My dad and I had lots of arguments, right, when we were talking about this early on in my late teens and early 20s. But now, and now he's like, I want to really dig in, I want to engage in this, and I'm like, okay, cool, you know, um, because but it's because there's love there, right? Like,
yeah.
how do I know what love is? Well, he's the guy that loved me first, right?
Hmm.
So if I'm able to, and that's not like a trite thing, like that's a real skill, like to
Yeah.
learn how to love through somebody through conflict, through
Hmm.
challenges, through ups and downs in the relationship. That's a testament to being able to do the thinking that's necessary to put yourself in somebody else's shoes.
Mm,
So I think first and foremost, starting to deal with whiteness means starting to deal with people who have different ideas and conceptions about the world than you do, and to build real relationships with them through, not by avoiding conflict, but by
yeah.
engaging in conflict and discussion and debate, um, in real ways, in authentic ways, in ways that respect the humanity of the person. If
Hmm.
you can start from that perspective, then people will be like, oh, okay, like this guy's not out to call me a racist or call me this or call me that,
Yeah, you're
or
not
he's not
trying to harm them.
not trying to harm. Well, I mean, it's antithetical, right?
Yeah,
If
yeah.
we're talking about justice, if we're talking about promoting justice and fairness in this work, if we're talking about building a more humane world, I can't dehumanize you through that process,
Right. Can't
right?
fight oppression with oppression, right?
You can't do the same thing,
Hmm.
right? Um, and also, if we're going to talk about racial justice, right, that involves an incredible amount of energy
It
to do
really
that.
does. It
And
really
so,
does.
like, white people are the folks that are furthest away from the direct pain of racism.
Mm,
And so while it might take a tremendous amount of energy to be able to have these conversations, we got to start having these conversations with each other in a humane way so that we can make some progress, because our Black and our brown brothers and sisters are tired
yeah.
of going through this process. And I think the most humane thing to do is to start humanizing each other and to start building relationships with each other so we can have real conversations.
Yeah, I feel the same. Um, I'm kind of speaking to the technical side of things. The
Yeah,
audience, you can't see Miles, but Miles, could we have that question again, please? Because I thought it was a nice one. Thank you. So Ivy Jones Turner would like to know, how do we help get people to question their cultural values? And I think this
great.
last thread of the conversation that we were just having kind of segues really nicely into that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that the first step always has to be humanizing people, right?
Right.
So humanizing them and making it really clear that maybe you disagree with an idea, but you see them as a full person that you
Yeah.
actually care about. And that can manifest in many ways. So really concretely, you can approach things through questions, right? So can you tell me more about why you think that? And I'm not questioning your knowledge or your expertise, but I haven't arrived at the same conclusion. So can you walk me through the thinking so that I can understand where you're coming from?
Mm-hmm.
That's often a good starting frame. I don't know, Chris, if you've got other things that came to your mind.
100% Rico. I mean, I think that's absolutely on point. I
Mm,
think starting with questions is how you get there, right? Because then, so think of it this way, right? If I start by making a statement about your cultural beliefs or your cult, right?
mm,
I'm making a whole set of assumptions about who you are, right? We
yeah,
already know. We just talked about the fact that we construct ourselves, right, through
yeah,
the course of our lives. So, in me saying I know how you define your own culture, I'm literally making a massive assumption about who you are and how you've constructed your identity. So, the
yeah,
first things first, you got to ask questions. I think that my favorite question for people vis-a-vis race, right, is if people are uncomfortable with exploring whiteness or exploring what it means to be white. I always ask them, like, what's the goal, right? Like,
yeah,
cultures have goals, right? Like, what what's the goal that you have, right, for not exploring whiteness? Like, why not, right?
yeah,
Because then you have to you have to dig for that answer, right? And if the answer is, well, it's unpatriotic, then you go from there and you go, well, what's patriotic, right? And then you go further and you go further and you just keep going and asking questions. And they're doing the talking, right? But I
yeah,
think the only way you can get people to that space of understanding their cultural values and the separation that the culture of white supremacy has from allowing even white people to have full humanity,
yes.
right,
I think that's so important
is
because
eventually
a lot of people think that questioning whiteness means devaluing white people, which is not the case at all.
not at all. Not at all. It's because I love white people that I want to deconstruct white supremacy. Real talk, like 100%. Like, I
Yeah.
love my mom, I love my dad, I love my family, I love the people in my community, right? I love my
Hmm.
neighbors,
Hmm.
right? I want them to be. I want full humanity for them,
Yeah. And
right?
I believe that all those people are worthy of love. So they are worthy of receiving it as themselves and not through the filters of this other stuff that we've
Right.
collectively built up.
So the danger in that is like, to you talk to like a typical white guy and you're like, you could be more of a human being, and he's like, oh, like, I am who I am and I like who I am, right? Like, I mean, that would be my response too on any day if someone told me I was incomplete, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Naturally.
But you can't get to that conversation, you can't get to what's missing, right? Again, this goes back to that conversation I was having earlier as a kid, where you like, so what is the deal? Like, I just grow up to own the house and like have 2.5 kids, and like they play soccer on the weekends, and I have beers in the backyard, like, well, my butt, like that's the thing, right?
Yeah.
That's what
Right.
this is,
Yeah.
right? So it's the incompleteness that you go towards,
Mm.
but by asking questions, because
Mhm.
you're only that my incompleteness might not be what someone's others that might be perfectly fine for somebody else.
Yeah.
But again, there are parts of this culture that says you have to be a white guy that's that's heteronormative, has 2.5 kids, owns property, owns a means of production,
Yeah.
is managing people, right, in order to be viewed as this success,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And if you don't have those things, then go to church,
Mm.
right? Because maybe there you'll start to feel included. And that's, again, I'm a Christian, so there's nothing against church, right? But
Mhm.
what I'm saying is that we start off as complete, and our culture tells us that we're not unless we do X things. And
Yeah.
we start to view people who are not those things in opposition to what's real, or excuse me, to what's ideal. And
Mm.
that's when we start to dehumanize them. So I want to go
Yeah.
through that. That's, again, great question.
Yeah. And yes, thank you, Ivy.
Thank you, Ivy. Great question.
Also, I think that now might be a good time to just acknowledge that I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, interrogating my own internalized whiteness, it was more than uncomfortable. It was painful. It made me sad. It really bummed me out. But after doing that and engaging in it, I am hopeful that I can do things so that, or I can change things. I can work on myself so that things don't have to, my life doesn't have to be that way forever. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know that Dr. Martin really loves to land things on hope. I wonder if
Yeah.
we could think of some hopeful way to land this chat.
Yeah. The hope in letting go of our investment in white supremacy culture is that we can be more complete human beings. I
That's
mean, what's
pretty.
more hopeful than that?
I don't know.
Right? I don't
I don't
I don't
know.
know either, right? And I've experienced it myself, right? I've been confronted by friends in the past where they're like, you're still trapped in your investment in this aspect of white supremacy or racism, etc.
Hmm.
And it's incredibly difficult to confront. But once you do, and you work through it, and through a tremendous amount of grace, right, I've still been able to maintain and build relationships with people that I care about who are willing to say those things to me.
Hmm.
In that process of moving through that, there's a tremendous amount of freedom on the other side
I agree.
to build the kind of person, right, to build the kind of life that you want.
You know, the other thing that I was reflecting on as you were speaking, Chris, is as soon as I really started to work on these things within myself, for one reason or another, I found myself meeting a lot of other people who are in the same space. So where I was afraid of maybe feeling alone,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really not alone now. You know, it's like I met you, I met Atia, I met so many incredible people, and I really do feel more energized and hopeful than ever.
I agree, and you're definitely not alone, this brother. There's and no one who engages in this work is,
Yeah,
because there's millions of people out here
yeah,
that are in the same frame of mind and want to start to unpack these things, and I think it's very hopeful that we're having these conversations, that people are
yeah.
tuning in, asking questions, and I hope we can continue to do it because that's where the hope lies.
Yeah, same here. So, Chris, thank you so much for being
Thank
here
you.
with me today. I really appreciate it. And what I think I'd like to say to the audience is if you're feeling kind of isolated and alone, well, in engaging in this work, well, now you've got two names and two faces that you can reach out to. So, I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak for you, Chris, but please do reach out to me
People
if
can
you.
absolutely reach out. The question is whether I'll get back. No, I, not that I
That's not
don't want
true.
to. I'm
Chris
just
always
a
gets
little
back to
slow.
people.
Yeah. uh,
All right. Well, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you
Thank you.
again, Chris Conroy. Everybody, please check out his podcast, Whiteness at Work. And Chris, I know that Buzzsprout is a great place to get your podcast, but where
Yep.
else can people get it?
So anywhere where you listen to podcasts, Apple, Google Podcasts, we're on iHeartRadio, we're on Amazon. You can just say, "Hey Alexa, play Whiteness at Work," and it'll pop up, and we'll get going.
All right. Thank you once again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a great day. Thanks, Rico.
Thank you.